The little girl was dying, and Sergei Volkov knew he had maybe 4 hours to save her before the Arctic cold claimed her permanently. Her name was Mira. She was only 6 years old, and she was strapped to his back in a makeshift carrier. Shivering violently despite the layers of thermal clothing and emergency blankets he'd wrapped around her tiny body. They were 50 miles from the nearest outpost, surrounded by nothing but ice and darkness and the kind of cold that turned breath to crystals and made every step a battle against nature itself. Sergei had survived worse situations in his 20 years as an operative, had escaped death traps that should have been impossible to survive, but he'd always been alone, responsible only for himself. This time was different. This time he carried the weight of an innocent life on his shoulders, and failure meant watching a child freeze to death in the Arctic wasteland. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what happens next will test every limit of human endurance and show you why they called Sergei the Guardian Wolf. And trust me, you need to see how this impossible night ends. Now, smash that like button if you believe some promises are worth dying for, because that's exactly what Sergei is about to prove. The crisis had started 6 hours earlier at Research Station Zima, a remote Russian scientific facility studying climate patterns in the Arctic Circle. Sergei had been there on routine security inspection when the distress call came in. A supply helicopter had gone down 20 miles east during a sudden whiteout storm, and the passenger manifest showed 3 scientists and 1 child aboard. The child was Myra Petrov, daughter of the station's lead researcher who'd been bringing her back from a medical appointment in Murmansk. The military said rescue operations would have to wait until morning when visibility improved and they could send proper equipment. Morning was 12 hours away. The crash survivors wouldn't last 12 hours in those temperatures. Sergei had looked at Dr. Petrov's face, seen the absolute terror there, the kind of fear that only parents know when their child is in mortal danger, and he'd made a decision that went against every protocol, every regulation, every piece of common sense he'd learned in 2 decades of survival training. He'd grabbed emergency supplies, strapped on Arctic gear, told the station commander he was going out there, alone, on foot, in conditions that had grounded helicopters and had veteran pilots shaking their heads. The commander had called him insane, had threatened to have him arrested for disobeying orders. Sergei had walked out anyway because some promises don't need words. The look in a father's eyes is promise enough. He found the crash site after 3 hours of brutal hiking through wind that felt like knives and snow, that tried to bury him with every step. The helicopter was a twisted wreck, half buried in a snowdrift, its rotors bent at impossible angles. The 3 scientists were already gone, killed on impact or shortly after by injuries too severe to survive. But in the back compartment, wrapped in her mother's coat and tucked into a survival kit, was Mira, alive. Barely, she was hypothermic, going in and out of consciousness, her lips blue and her small body racked with shivers that were starting to slow down. The dangerous kind of slowdown that meant her body was giving up the fight to stay warm. Sergei had performed rapid triage with hands that were already losing feeling. Myra's core temperature was dangerously low, maybe 92 degrees if he was lucky. She needed warmth, medical attention, for fluids, and oxygen, all things he didn't have. What he did have was his own body heat, emergency blankets, chemical heating pads, and a promise he'd made without speaking. He'd fashioned a carrier from cargo straps and emergency webbing, created a cocoon of insulation around Myra's small body, and strapped her to his back so his own body heat would help keep her alive. Then he'd started the 50-mile journey back to Station Zima. The first hour had been manageable. Sergei was strong, trained for extreme conditions, and he'd made good time despite the extra weight. But the Arctic didn't care about training or determination. The temperature was dropping as night fell, already hitting -40 Fahrenheit with wind chill that made it feel like -60. Sergei's GPS had failed within 30 minutes, its electronics frozen solid. His radio worked intermittently but mostly just gave him static and broken messages that did nothing to help. He was navigating by landmarks he dememorized on the way out, and by instinct honed through years of operations in hostile environments. But those landmarks were disappearing in the growing darkness and the constant snow. By the second hour, Myra had stopped shivering. That should have been a relief, her body warming up, the danger passing, but Sergei knew better. Stopping shivering meant her body was conserving energy for vital organs, meant she was slipping deeper into hypothermia, meant he was running out of time faster than he'd calculated. He'd checked her pulse at her neck, felt it weak and irregular, and pushed himself to move faster despite the exhaustion already creeping into his muscles. Every step was a negotiation with his body. Every breath burned his lungs with cold so intense it felt like inhaling broken glass. "Stay with me, little one," he'd said, his voice hoarse from the cold and the effort. "I promised your father I'd bring you home. I keep my promises." Mira hadn't responded, but he'd felt the slight pressure of her small body against his back, felt her shallow breaths creating tiny puffs of warmth against his neck. She was still alive, still fighting, and as long as she fought, Sergei would carry her through hell itself if necessary. The night of terror on the ice had only just begun, and the Guardian Wolf had 48 miles left to go with his precious load. The Arctic didn't care about promises or father's tears or 6-year-old girls who deserved to live, but Sergei Volkov did, and he would not let the ice win. Not tonight. Not ever. The third hour was when Sergei's body started to betray him. His legs, which had carried him through war zones and across mountain ranges and through forests that tried to swallow him, began to feel like they belonged to someone else. Each step required conscious thought, deliberate effort to lift in place and push forward. His toes had gone numb an hour ago, and now the numbness was creeping up his feet and into his ankles. Frostbite, definitely. How severe? He couldn't tell. It didn't matter anyway, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Myra died too. So he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, through snow that was now waist-deep in places and wind that tried to knock him down with every gust. He talked to Myra constantly, even though she couldn't respond, maybe couldn't even hear him. He told her about his daughter Sofia, who was 11 now and living with her mother in Moscow. He told her about the time Sofia had gotten lost in a shopping mall when she was Myra's age, how terrified he'd been for the 15 minutes before they found her. He told her that fathers never stop being afraid for their children, never stop wanting to protect them from everything in the world that could hurt them. He talked because the sound of his own voice was proof he was still conscious, still functioning, still capable of completing the mission, and because maybe, somewhere in Myra's hypothermic mind, she could hear him and know she wasn't alone. The landscape around them had become an alien world. The storm had intensified, turning everything into a white void where sky and ground blended together, where distance and direction became meaningless. Sergei had learned Arctic navigation from Nenet's elders during a training operation years ago, and he used those skills now. The way snow accumulated on rocks told him wind direction. The slight slope of the ground told him he was moving generally west toward the coast where Station Zima sat. The occasional glimpse of stars through the clouds gave him north. It wasn't precise, but precision wasn't required. Only forward motion mattered. Only reaching help before Myra's small heart stopped beating. Around hour 4, Sergei fell. Not a stumble or a slip, but a complete system failure where his legs simply stopped responding and he went down face first into the snow. The fall was gentle by virtue of the snow's depth, but the impact still drove the air from his lungs and sent Myra's carrier crashing into his shoulders with bruising force. He lay there for 10 seconds, maybe 20, feeling the cold seeping through his layers of clothing, feeling exhaustion pulling at him like gravity had suddenly tripled. It would be so easy to just stay down, to let the snow cover them, to let the cold take away the pain and the fear and the crushing responsibility of keeping this child alive. But then Myra made a sound, not a word, not even a clear vocalization, just a tiny whimper that might have been pain or fear or a dream. And that sound cut through Sergei's exhaustion like a scalpel, sharp and clarifying. He pushed himself up, first to his knees, then to his feet, using a technique he de-learned from a Siberian survival instructor. Break down the impossible into small possible actions. Don't think about standing. Think about moving one hand, then the other, then one knee. Build from there. 5 small successes that added up to one large one. Standing again, moving again, living again. The northern lights appeared as if in answer to a prayer Sergei hadn't realized he was saying. Green and purple and blue waves dancing across the sky, illuminating the landscape with ethereal light that turned the ice into something beautiful and terrible. In any other circumstance, Sergei would have stopped to appreciate the sight. He'd seen the aurora borealis dozens of times in his career, but it never stopped being magnificent. Tonight, though, he barely glanced at it except to use its light for navigation. Beauty was a luxury he couldn't afford, but he did whisper to Myra, "Look, little one. The angels are dancing. They're showing us the way home." By hour 5, Sergei had entered a state that military psychologists call the endurance trance. His conscious mind stepped back, letting instinct and training take over. His body moved automatically, finding the most efficient path, conserving energy without conscious calculation. His breathing synchronized with his steps. Inhale for 3 steps, exhale for 3 steps, exhale for 3 steps. His vision narrowed to just the next obstacle, the next landmark, the next 10 meters of frozen ground. Everything else, the pain, the cold, the fear, became background noise that his mind filed away as irrelevant to the immediate goal of forward motion. He checked Myra's pulse again, pressing numb fingers against her neck and counting beats. 42 per minute, too slow, dangerously slow. A healthy 6-year-old should have a resting heart rate around 90. 42 meant her body was shutting down, conserving energy, preparing to die. Sergei readjusted her insulation, added his last chemical heating pad to her core, and tried to project warmth through sheer force of will. He thought about all the tactical training he'd received, all the weapon systems he'd mastered, all the languages he spoke. None of it mattered now. The only skill that mattered was the ability to keep walking while carrying 50 pounds of child, and gear through conditions that would kill most people in under an hour. A sound cut through the wind, mechanical, distant but unmistakable. A helicopter. Sergei's heart surged with hope before military discipline crushed it down. They'd said no rescue operations until morning. The weather conditions made flying suicidal. What he was hearing could be audio hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and desperation. But he pulled out his emergency flare anyway, the last one he had, and fired it into the sky. Red phosphorus blazed upward, painting the night in crimson light. If there was a helicopter, they'd see it. If there wasn't, he'd just wasted his last signaling device. But Mira was dying, and hope was worth the gamble. The helicopter sound faded without change in direction or volume. No searchlight swept across the ice looking for it. No rescue was coming. It had been a hallucination after all, or maybe a commercial flight 30,000 feet above, too high to see his flare or help even if they wanted to. Sergei felt something crack inside his chest, not physically but emotionally. For the first time since he'd started this impossible trek, he let himself acknowledge the truth. He might not make it, he might fail. Myra might die in his arms, and he might die beside her, and they'd become statistics in the Arctic's endless collection of foolish people who thought they could beat the cold. But then he felt Myra's hand impossibly, incredibly grip his collar through the carrier straps. Just a tiny squeeze. Weak as a butterfly landing, but deliberate. Conscious she was still in there. Still fighting. Still holding on to life with the determination that children have before the world teaches them to give up. And if she could hold on, then damn it, so could he. Sergei adjusted her weight on his back, found a reserve of strength he didn't know he had, and pushed forward into the darkness. The guardian wolf and his little load, angels dancing in the sky above them, death walking beside them, and 30 miles still to go before dawn. If you're still watching, drop a like right now, because what happens in the next hour will show you the true meaning of never giving up, no matter what hell throws at you. Hour 6 brought hallucinations in earnest. Sergei saw his daughter Sophia walking beside him in the snow, wearing her favorite pink jacket, asking him why he was taking so long to come home. He saw his ex-wife standing on an ice ridge ahead, shaking her head in disappointment like she had so many times during their marriage, telling him he was always choosing duty over family. He saw his old commander from Spetsnaz, the man who trained him to survive anything, offering him a flask of vodka and telling him it was okay to rest, that he'd done enough. Each hallucination was crystal clear, more real than the actual landscape, and each time Sergei had to consciously remind himself they were lies. His oxygen-starved brain was telling him the only thing he trusted was the weight on his back. Mira's presence was real, tangible, undeniable. Every few minutes he'd reach back and touch her arm through the carrier, feel for her pulse against his palm, listen for her breathing. Each time he confirmed she was still alive, still with him, he felt a surge of determination that pushed back the exhaustion for another few steps. She was his anchor to reality, his proof that this night mattered, that pushing forward was worth the cost. As long as she lived, he had a purpose. As long as she needed him, he couldn't fail. The temperature continued dropping. Sergei's GPS watch, which had stopped working hours ago, showed -54 Fahrenheit before it died completely. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Breath crystallizes instantly. Metal burns like fire to the touch. Sergei's face was covered by a balaclava and goggles, but he could feel ice building up around his mouth and nose where his breath escaped, creating a frozen mask that made breathing increasingly difficult. His hands inside their thermal gloves had lost almost all sensation. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Couldn't tell if he was gripping his walking stick or if it was just frozen to his palm, and then he saw the light. Not a hallucination this time, but something real. A steady glow on the horizon, yellow and warm, completely out of place in this frozen hell. Sergei stopped walking for the first time in an hour, staring at that impossible light, trying to make his exhausted brain interpret what he was seeing. Research Station Zima was still 25 miles away according to his last reliable calculation. There shouldn't be anything out here. No lights, no structures, no signs of human presence. But the light was undeniably there, and it wasn't moving like the aurora, wasn't flickering like fire. It was electric, artificial, deliberately placed. He changed course slightly, angling toward the light, knowing it might be a trap or a mistake, but unable to ignore any possibility of help for Myra. Each step toward that glow felt like betraying his training, which said to stick to the plan, to not deviate from the established route. But training also said to adapt to changing circumstances, to take calculated risks when the alternative was certain death. And Mira was dying. He could feel her breaths becoming more shallow, feel her small body losing even more heat despite his efforts. The light was a gamble, but continuing on his original path was gambling too. At least this gamble offered hope. It took 30 minutes to reach the source of the light. 30 minutes that felt like hours. The structure revealed itself gradually through the snow and darkness. A small emergency shelter, one of dozens placed across the Arctic by the Russian government in the 1980s for exactly this kind of situation. Sergei had known they existed but had thought most were destroyed or buried by decades of ice. This one was intact, maintained, with solar panels on the roof providing power to a beacon light meant to guide lost travelers. It was a miracle, or the closest thing to a miracle that Sergei believed in. The door was frozen shut, but Sergei had tools and desperation and the strength of someone who carried 60 pounds through 50 miles of Arctic conditions. He forced the door open and stumbled inside, his legs finally giving out now that safety was achieved. He fell to his knees on the shelter's metal floor, carefully maneuvering so Myra's carrier didn't hit anything. The shelter was tiny, maybe 10 feet square, with a chemical toilet in one corner and storage lockers along the walls. But it had a heating unit, battery-powered and insulated walls that blocked the wind. After 6 hours in the open Arctic, it felt like paradise. Sergei's hands barely responded as he fumbled Mira out of the carrier. She was so cold, her skin gray, her lips almost black. He could unfind her pulse at first and felt panic surge before his trembling fingers finally located at 38 beats per minute. She was alive, barely, her body in deep hypothermia, shutting down everything non-essential to preserve the core. He stripped away the frozen layers of her outer clothing and wrapped her in the emergency blankets stored in the shelter's lockers, activated the heating unit and aimed its pathetic warmth toward her. Then he did the thing that Arctic survival manuals recommended but most people found unthinkable. He removed his own outer layers and pulled Myra against his bare chest, skin to skin, using his body heat to rewarm her core. The cold of her small body against his was shocking, like hugging ice given human shape. But slowly, gradually, impossibly, he felt warmth beginning to return. Mira's breathing deepened slightly. Her heart rate ticked up to 40, then 42, then 45. Color began returning to her lips in tiny increments, black to blue to purple to the faintest hint of pink. She was responding. She was coming back. Sergei held her and talked to her and promised her father would hold her soon. Promised she'd grow up and have adventures and live to tell stories about the crazy night she survived the Arctic with a stranger. Hours passed in that shelter. Sergei couldn't tell how many because his watch was dead and time had become meaningless anyway. He drifted in and out of consciousness, maintaining enough awareness to monitor Myra but not enough to truly count as awake. At some point she opened her eyes, looked at him with confusion and fear, and whispered, "Where's Mama?" Sergei told her the truth as gently as he could. Mama didn't make it, but she'd made sure Mira was protected. She'd wrapped her in her own coat and put her in the safest part of the helicopter. She'd saved her daughter with her last actions. Mira cried then, and Sergei held her and let her cry, because grief was healthy and natural and had to be processed. "Who are you?" Mira asked finally, her voice tiny and rough. "My name is Sergei. I work at the place your father works. He asked me to bring you home, so that's what I'm doing." Myra studied his face with those serious 6-year-old eyes. "Are you an angel?" Mama said angels protect children. Sergei felt something break and heal simultaneously in his chest. "No, little one, I'm not an angel. I'm just a man who made a promise. But maybe the angels helped us tonight. Maybe that's why we found this shelter. Maybe that's why you're still alive." The heating unit was running low on power. Sergei knew they couldn't stay here indefinitely, but they could rest for a few hours. Let Myra's body recover some strength. Let his own body recover enough to continue. They had maybe 15 miles left to Station Zima, 15 miles that would have been impossible with Myra in her previous state, but might be manageable now. He gave her tiny sips of water from his canteen, rationed out some emergency chocolate that she ate mechanically, and told her stories about Sofia and Moscow and all the wonderful things waiting for her once they got home. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink visible through the shelter's small window, Sergei made the decision to move. Myra was stable enough for transport, and staying here meant slowly dying as the power ran out and the cold crept back in. He fashioned the carrier again, placed Myra back in her cocoon of insulation, and shouldered her weight one more time. His body screamed in protest, muscles torn, joints damaged, feet likely seriously frostbitten, but pain was just information. It told him he was alive, and if he was alive, he could keep moving. They left the shelter as the sun broke the horizon, and Sergei marked its location in his mind in case anyone else ever needed to find it. Then he turned toward Station Zima and started walking. The guardian wolf and his little load, having survived the night of terror on the ice, now just had to survive the final stretch, 15 miles. He'd done 50 already. What was 15 more? Everything, it turned out. Because those last miles are always the hardest, but they're also where heroes are made. If you've made it this far in the video, you know what it means to never give up. Drop a like for Sergei and Mira. They earned it. Mile 46 was when Sergei saw the rescue team. They appeared like mirages at first, dark figures moving across the white landscape, and Sergei's exhausted mind couldn't immediately process whether they were real or another hallucination. But then he heard engines, snowmobiles, multiple ones, their distinctive whine cutting through the Arctic silence, and voices calling out in Russian, calling his name. "Sergei Volkov, can you hear us? We're coming." He tried to respond, but his voice barely worked, reduced to a rasp by hours of breathing frozen air. He raised his arm instead, waving, the universal signal for "I'm here, I need help." The snowmobiles changed direction, racing toward him, and within minutes they'd reached him. For people in heavy Arctic gear surrounded him immediately, hands supporting him, voices asking questions. Dr. Petrov was there, Mira's father, his face desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. Where is she? Is she alive? Please tell me she's alive. Alive, Sergei managed to croak. Carrier on my back, hypothermic but stable. Hands carefully removed the carrier, and Sergei felt Mira's weight lifted from him. He almost collapsed without that weight. Had gotten so used to carrying it that its absence made him unstable. Someone caught him, lowered him to a sitting position in the snow. He watched through blurry vision as they unwrapped Myra, as Dr. Petrov took his daughter in his arms and started crying, pressing his face against her hair. A paramedic was checking her vitals, speaking into a radio, coordinating helicopter evacuation now that the weather had cleared enough for safe flight. You did it, someone said to Sergei. He looked up and saw the station's Zima commander, the man who'd called him insane for going out into the storm. You actually did it. Walked 50 miles in Arctic conditions carrying a child. That single quotes S ... double quotes he trailed off, apparently unable to find words. Sergei just nodded. Words weren't important. Myra was alive. That was all that mattered. Everything else, the pain, the exhaustion, the frostbite that was probably going to cost him several toes and possibly worse, was secondary to that single, essential fact. He'd kept his promise. The little load had been delivered safely. The medical team descended on Sergei with the efficiency of professionals who knew exactly how close to death he'd come. They removed his boots gently, and he saw their faces when they saw his feet gray and black. Obviously frostbitten, probably requiring serious intervention to save. They checked his core temperature and exchanged worried looks when they saw the reading. They started an IV line to get fluids into him, wrapped him in thermal blankets that felt warm as fire against his frozen body. Every action was accompanied by reassurance, by praise for what he'd accomplished, by promises that both he and Mira would be fine. The helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, a heavy transport that could carry multiple patients. They loaded Myra first, still unconscious but breathing steadily now, her vitals improving by the minute. Dr. Petrov climbed in beside her, refusing to leave her side. Then they loaded Sergei, strapping him to a stretcher because his legs had finally given out completely and would unsupport his weight anymore. As the helicopter lifted off, Sergei looked out the window at the landscape they'd crossed. From above it looked peaceful, beautiful even, the sun creating diamonds out of the ice crystals, the wind creating artistic patterns in the snowdrifts. Nothing about it suggested the terror it had held during the night. The flight to Murmansk took 3 hours. 3 hours during which medical staff worked on both Sergei and Mira, stabilizing them for the proper hospital care they'd receive on landing. Sergei drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally allowing itself to shut down now that safety was achieved. He dreamed of Sofia, of holding her when she was Mira's age, of the weight of her small body in his arms, and the trust children have that adults will keep them safe. He'd kept Mira safe. He'd been worthy of that trust. In a career filled with morally gray operations and compromises and actions he wasn't always proud of, this was something pure. This was something good. They landed at Murmansk Central Hospital, where specialists were waiting. Sergei was wheeled to emergency surgery for his frostbite injuries, told he'd lose 3 toes on his left foot and possibly more depending on how the tissue responded to treatment. He accepted this news without emotion. Toes were a small price to pay for a life saved. Before they put him under anesthesia, he asked about Mira. The surgeon smiled and told him she was in pediatric intensive care, responding well to treatment, expected to make a full recovery. You saved her life, the surgeon said. You're a hero. Sergei wanted to protest, to say he'd just done what anyone would do, but the anesthesia pulled him under before he could form the words. His last thought before darkness took him was that heroes were people who made impossible choices look easy, and what he'd done had been anything but easy. He'd been terrified the entire night, had doubted himself countless times, had nearly failed more than once. That wasn't heroism. That was just stubbornness and a promise made to a desperate father. But maybe that's what heroism actually was, not the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear win. Sergei woke 3 days later in a private hospital room. His left foot wrapped in bandages and elevated, his body connected to monitors that beeped softly. The first thing he saw was Sofia, his daughter, sitting in a chair beside his bed doing homework. She looked up when she heard him stir, and her face transformed with relief and joy. "Papa, you're awake." She stood carefully, moving to hug him without disturbing the medical equipment. And Sergei wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the reality of her presence ground him in the present. "Your mother let you fly here?" he asked, his voice rough from intubation and disuse. Sofia nodded. She didn't want to, but the hospital said it would help you recover faster if family was here. And when everyone found out what you did, how you saved that little girl, even Mama had to admit you'd done something important. Sergei absorbed this, surprised and touched. His ex-wife hadn't spoken well of him in years. Their divorce bit her and his career a constant source of conflict. That she'd acknowledged his actions meant something significant had shifted. Over the next few days, Sergei learned the full story of what had happened while he was unconscious. The rescue team had set out at dawn when weather permitted, following his emergency beacon signal which had kept transmitting despite the cold. They'd expected to find him dead or dying, had been prepared for recovery rather than rescue. Finding him alive with Myra in stable condition had shocked everyone. The station commander had filed a commendation report, recommending Sergei for the Order of Courage, one of Russia's highest civilian honors. Media had picked up the story, and suddenly Sergei was famous, the guardian wolf who carried a child 50 miles through Arctic night to save her life. He hated the attention, the cameras and reporters who tried to get into his hospital room, the politicians who wanted photo opportunities with the hero of the hour. All he'd done was refuse to let a child die when he had the ability to prevent it. That shouldn't be remarkable. That should be baseline human decency. But the hospital staff told him stories of how his actions had affected people, had inspired donations to Arctic safety programs, had made parents hold their children tighter and appreciate the fragility and preciousness of life. Maybe the attention was worth it if it led to something good. Myra visited him on his 5th day in the hospital. She walked into his room holding her father's hand, still pale and thin but alive and alert and recognizably the child she'd been before the crash. She carried a drawing she'd made, a picture of a wolf carrying a small figure on its back, with stars and northern lights drawn above them in crayon. "I made this for you," she said shyly, approaching his bed. "Because you're the guardian wolf and you saved me. Papa says I should say thank you. But thank you doesn't feel like enough." Sergei took the drawing with hands that were still bandaged but functional, studied the child's artwork that somehow captured the essence of their night on the ice. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "I did what needed to be done. Anyone else would have done the same." Myra shook her head seriously. "No. Papa says other people said it was impossible, that we should wait until morning. You're the only one who came. You're the only one who thought I was worth saving right away instead of later." Dr. Petrov spoke from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. "I can never repay what you did. You gave me my daughter back when everyone else said to accept she was gone. There aren't words for that kind of gift." Sergei looked at this man who'd been a stranger before the crisis, who was now bound to him by the most powerful connection possible: a life saved, a child returned. "Love your daughter. Be present in her life. Make sure she knows every day that she's cherished. That's all the repayment I need." They talked for a while, Myra showing him more drawings, telling him about the hospital food, and the nice nurses and how she was going to live with her grandmother now because Mama was gone. She spoke about her mother's death with the matter-of-fact sadness of a child who hasn't fully processed trauma yet, who understands the facts but not the permanence. Sergei knew that grief would hit her later, would shape her in ways both terrible and profound. But she'd survived to experience that grief, and survival was everything. Sofia and Mira became fast friends during that visit. The 11-year-old taking the 6-year-old under her wing, showing her the hospital cafeteria and the playroom and teaching her a card game. Watching them together, Sergei understood something fundamental about the night on the ice. He hadn't just saved Myra's life. He'd saved all the moments she'd have in the future, all the friendships and experiences and ordinary joys that make up a life. Every time she laughed or learned something new or made someone smile, that was because he'd refused to give up during that impossible night. 2 weeks later, Sergei was released from the hospital. He'd lost 3 toes on his left foot as predicted, along with parts of 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite. His doctors said he'd walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life and would have reduced dexterity in his right hand. His career as a field operative was effectively over. The Russian government offered him a desk position, a reward for his heroism that would keep him comfortable and useful without requiring the physical capabilities he no longer had. He accepted, recognizing that maybe it was time to step back from the front lines anyway. The award ceremony was held at the Kremlin, with full military honors and media coverage. Sergei wore his dress uniform and stood while a general pinned the Order of Courage to his chest and read the citation: "For exceptional bravery in the line of duty, for risking his life to save a child in extreme conditions, for demonstrating the highest ideals of selfless service, we honor Sergei Volkov, the guardian wolf of the Arctic." The audience applauded, and Sergei saw Sofia in the front row crying with pride, saw Mira and her father beside her, saw his ex-wife smiling despite herself. But the moment Sergei would remember most came later, at a small private gathering in the hospital where he'd recovered. The staff had organized a celebration, and someone had made a cake decorated with a wolf carrying a small figure. The children's ward patients were there, kids battling cancer and injuries and illnesses, kids who understood better than most how fragile life was. Myra stood before them and told the story of the night on the ice, how the guardian wolf had carried her through darkness and cold and never once considered putting her down. "He taught me something important," she said, her small voice clear. "He taught me that when things are scary and dark and you do unthink, you can keep going. You keep going anyway, because someone is counting on you. Because promises matter. Because love is stronger than fear." Sergei felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. A child understood what many adults never learned, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That heroism isn't about being superhuman, but about being fully human. About caring enough to sacrifice your own safety for another person's survival. Myra had distilled the essence of that night into simple truth, and hearing it from her perspective showed Sergei that he hadn't just saved one life. He'd shown everyone who heard the story what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept the unacceptable. The months that followed brought changes Sergei hadn't anticipated. His desk job at FSB headquarters was meaningful in ways fieldwork had never been. He helped design better emergency protocols for Arctic operations, consulted on survival training programs, worked with equipment manufacturers to improve cold weather gear. His experience that night had revealed gaps in preparation that could be fixed, had shown weaknesses in response procedures that could be strengthened. Every improvement he helped implement meant future lives saved, future Myras who wouldn't be abandoned because the conditions seemed too difficult. Sofia visited more often now that he was stationed permanently in Moscow. Their relationship, strained by years of his absences and dangerous work, began to heal. She'd tell him about school and friends and the ordinary teenage dramas that seemed monumental at 14 but would fade into memory by 20. And Sergei learned to listen, really listen, without the part of his brain that was always calculating threats and planning operations. He learned to be present, to value these quiet moments with his daughter as much as he'd once valued successful missions. Mira had taught him that carrying someone doesn't have to be literal. Sometimes it means simply being there, consistently and fully. Mira herself thrived in ways that surprised everyone. Therapy helped her process her mother's death and the trauma of the crash. Her grandmother provided the stable, loving home she needed. But more than that, Myra seemed to have extracted something precious from the terror of that night. She'd learned at 6 years old that she could survive impossible things, that adults would show up for her even when it seemed hopeless, that the world contained both terrible dangers and incredible kindness. She was braver than most children her age, more willing to try new things, more appreciative of ordinary comforts. The ice hadn't broken her. It had tempered her, made her stronger. Every year on the anniversary of the crash, Sergei, Mira, her father and Sofia would gather for a quiet dinner. No media, no ceremony, just for people who'd been changed by one night in the Arctic. They'd share updates on their lives, remember Mira's mother with stories and photos, and toast to survival and the bonds forged in crisis. These dinners became sacred to Sergei, more meaningful than any military decoration or commendation. This was his real reward, being part of Myra's life, watching her grow, knowing that every milestone she reached existed because he'd refused to give up during those dark hours. When Myra turned 12, 6 years after the crash, she asked Sergei to take her back to the Arctic, not to the crash site, which would have been too traumatic, but to see the landscape in daylight, in safety, to understand the place that had nearly killed her but hadn't. Her father was hesitant, but Sergei understood immediately. She needed to reclaim that space, to transform it from a source of nightmares into just geography. They organized a summer trip to a research station, brought Sofia along, and spent a week in the Arctic during the brief season when the land was untrying to kill you. Standing together on the tundra, looking out at endless horizons of ice and sky, Mira said something that Sergei would carry forever. "I used to be angry about that night. Angry that Mama died, angry that I had to be scared, angry that I lost something I can never get back. But now I think maybe I gained something too. I learned what people are capable of. I learned that someone I'd never met would walk through hell to save me just because it was the right thing to do. That's not nothing, that's everything." Sergei looked at this young woman who'd once been a small frozen child on his back and saw resilience that inspired him. "You taught me something too," he said. "You taught me that some burdens aren't burdens at all, that carrying someone can be a privilege, that the weight we carry for others is what makes us human." Myra smiled and took his hand, and Sofia took his other hand, and they stood together in the land that had tried to claim them but failed. Years later, when Sergei was giving a lecture at the military academy on Arctic survival, a young cadet asked him the question everyone always asked eventually: "Were you ever afraid during that night? Did you ever think about giving up?" Sergei answered honestly, the way he always did. "I was terrified every single second. My body was failing, the cold was winning, and I knew I might be carrying that child to both our deaths. I thought about giving up more times than I can count." "Then why didn't you?" the cadet pressed. Sergei thought about all the complex answers he could give, all the military training and survival psychology and operational doctrine. But the truth was simpler than all of that. Because she was 6 years old and she deserved a chance to grow up. Because her father's face when he begged me to save her was the face of every parent who has ever feared losing a child. Because I'd made a promise, and promises matter. But mostly, I didn't give up because the moment you decide a life is worth saving is the moment you lose your own humanity. And I'd rather die trying than live knowing I'd chosen comfort over courage. The lecture hall was silent for a long moment, and then the cadets applauded. But Sergei knew some lessons can't be taught in classrooms. Some things you only learn when you're re-walking through Arctic darkness with a dying child on your back and nothing but will keeping you moving. Those are the lessons that define who you are, that separate people who talk about heroism from people who live it. On Sergei's 60th birthday, long after he'd retired from government service entirely, his apartment doorbell rang. He opened it to find Myra, now a 24-year-old woman finishing her medical degree, holding a wrapped package. She'd grown into someone remarkable, confident, compassionate, brilliant. She was specializing in emergency medicine, drawn to the field by her own experience with trauma and survival. "I wanted to give you this in person," she said, handing him the package. Inside was a painting, professionally done, showing a wolf carrying a small figure through a night landscape illuminated by northern lights. But unlike the crayon drawing from her childhood, this was sophisticated and beautiful, capturing both the terror and the transcendence of that night. In the corner, a small plaque read, "To the guardian wolf who taught me that love is carrying someone through their darkest night. You are the reason I'm here to save others now. With eternal gratitude." Mira. Sergei hung the painting in his living room where he'd see it every day, a reminder of the night that had cost him toes and fingers in his field career, but had given him something more valuable. The knowledge that his life had mattered, that his choices had created ripples that would extend far beyond him. Mira would save lives as a doctor, would carry people through their own dark nights, would pass forward the gift he'd given her. That was legacy. That was immortality of the only kind that actually mattered. And sometimes, late at night when Moscow was quiet, Sergei would stand before that painting and remember the weight on his back and the cold in his bones and the aurora dancing overhead. Remember the impossible distance and the failing strength and the promise that kept him moving. Remember the little girl who'd trusted a stranger to carry her home, and how that trust had transformed him from a weapon into a guardian, from a soldier into a father, from someone who took lives into someone who'd given everything to preserve one. The night of terror on the ice was long past, but its lessons remained. We are what we carry. We are the promises we keep when keeping them seems impossible. We are the choices we make when darkness surrounds us and giving up would be so easy. Sergei had chosen to keep walking, and that choice had echoed through decades, touching more lives than he'd ever known. The guardian wolf had carried his little load home, and in doing so, had shown the world what humans are capable of when we remember that every life is precious. Every child deserves protection, and some promises are worth dying for, which means they're definitely worth living for. If you've made it to the end of this story, you understand what it means to never give up, to carry others through their darkest moments, to be the person who shows up when everyone else says it's impossible. Hit that subscribe button to hear more stories of courage, compassion, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when faced with impossible choices. And drop a like if you believe, like Sergei and Mira, that we are all capable of being guardians for each other, that we all carry the strength to walk through our own nights of terror if we just refuse to stop moving forward. Because that's the truth this story teaches. We are stronger than we know, braver than we believe, and capable of miracles when someone we love is counting on us. The guardian wolf proved it, and so can you.